Now look, if we go back in history, if we go to from the 1880s or so, from the European invasions of the 1880s through to the 1960s, the perception of Africa as an area of agriculture is that Africa is a land of opportunity. It's a place where you can grow valuable crops. Here's some cocoa from Ghana. Here's some coffee. And that nice historical photograph there is arachide. It's groundnut in Senegal. Africa is a land which has abundant areas to create cash crops of relatively high value for the metropolitan centers and could be a source of growth and prosperity. The Kenyan version of this, of course, goes into overdrive after the Swinnerton Plan of 1954, which then allowed smallholders to grow tea, coffee, and other crops. So we have that long period there where Africa is seen as a land of opportunity. But we come to the 1970s or so, and history starts moving in a rather different way. And this slide just says the dreadful 1970s. Now look, all the way up to the 1970s, the performance of Africa isn't notably worse than that of the other big areas of the developing world. Indeed, if we stop that round about 1970, you'd say, good heavens, there's not much of a difference between Africa's performance and that of Asia and Latin America. But of course, as we go into the 1970s, we have this terrible period here in which food production per capita is actually falling in Africa to an index of less than 10%, more than 10% worse than it was in the early 1960s. And Asia, under the power of the Green Revolution, is plus 30%, and South America is plus 15%. So these sorts of graphs showed a rather dreadful Africa. And at those times, we also have the enormous drought that took place in the Sahelian countries from 1968 to 1973, all the way from Senegal across to Sudan. There were 5 years of consecutive drought. And during that time, there was enormous loss of herds, there were loss of livelihoods. It's a good question as to what extent it was a famine, but it was seen internationally as a massive crisis, and it was seen at the time as an anthropogenic crisis. Anthropogenic, if I can even pronounce the word, means human-made, yeah? And an old word out of French came back into fashion, desertification, desertification, yeah? And what was happening in Sahel was the consequence of overpopulation, overgrazing, overcultivation, etc. Now, those of you who study climate change in Africa, you'll say, what idiots we were in the 1970s, or they were in the 1970s. We now know that what happened in the Sahel in the early 1970s was probably a very early indication of climate change. It was ocean currents that were changing. It was not what people were doing in the Sahel. The people in the Sahel were blamed as being the inadvertent causes of what was happening there. What was happening was probably a result of the release of greenhouse gases in the north. But the Sahel cast Africa as a land not of opportunity, but a land of crisis. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, social scientists like myself, there was an industry of explaining in Africa not opportunity, but what had gone wrong. And the favored explanations that came out at the time, I've grouped them into three. One set of explanations, which I really don't like at all, are explanations that said the problems that Africa is undergoing are peculiar to Africa. These are exceptional circumstances of Africa. And two things appeared in the literature. One was that it was Africa's geography. It was poor soils. It was lack of reliable rain. It was malaria. There's even a hypothesis that says the very shape of Africa is actually a problem for economic growth, yeah? And I'm delighted we can laugh about this but people got seriously excited. There were special things about Africa. More specifically, a whole bunch of people said it's the land tenure. It's collective land tenure, communal land tenure, and so on that is holding Africa back. So, arguments about exceptionalism. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, in the 1970s, there was a strain of radicalism in Africa, a very powerful strain of radicalism in thinking about Africa, which said that Africa's problems are the way that it is inserted in a world capitalist economy, that it's on the periphery, that it suffers from dependency, debt, bad trading relationships, and so on. It's subject to mechanisms of exploitation, and whilst we have a capitalist world system and capitalist African economies, we will be trapped in underdevelopment and so on. These were very powerful ideas at the time. They've faded very considerably, except yesterday I pick up whichever newspaper it is. Is it The Nation that we're getting, which says that coffee farmers are being exploited by international cartels, and so on. So a second area was that it was external forces that were raimed against Africa and condemning Africa to underdevelopment. The third set of explanations said, well, actually, as far as agriculture is concerned, what we're dealing with is poor policy. And two particular sets of things were seized upon here. One was an argument about urban bias in the writings of people like Robert Bates, and there was the economic explanation of farmers being subject to what in economic jargon is called negative protection. Now, we'll look at negative protection in just a moment and explain what it is for those of you who aren't economists. And the other thing that people were looking at was the operations of marketing boards and excessive state intervention in the economy. And probably if you want to cite chapter and verse on expensive and very costly marketing boards, you're into the literature on Tanzania. Now, of those explanations, this one, I think most people would say, well, there are elements of that, but it's not that important. For all kinds of reasons, those arguments have taken a back step. These arguments here are the ones that have tended to persist, that have said it was policy problems that led to the dreadful 1970s for agriculture. Now, what we're going to look at here is this argument about negative protection. And we've got quite a complicated graph here. It's running from 1955 to 2005. And what we're looking at here is the net rate of assistance to agriculture. And what this is basically saying is that when you look at the direct and implicit taxation of farmers, minus whatever support they're receiving from the state, what is the total rate of taxation of farmers? Now, if I show you the first curve here, we can talk about what this is showing. This is our first curve here, which is looking at all agriculture over this period. And basically what it's saying is that all the way through to the mid-1980s, we've got quite strong taxation, below minus 10%. But more pertinent than this curve is the curve for exportable crops, cash crops. And what this shows is that cash crops in the 1970s were being taxed on average by as much as 50%. Now, those taxes weren't direct taxes. Most of that was coming through exchange rate overvaluation and protection of industrial sectors. And if you want to look at the classic case of this negative protection, this very low rate of assistance to agriculture, we look no further than Ghana and its cocoa sector. By the late 1970s, the situation in Ghana was that the cedi was massively overvalued. So cocoa sold at an international price, there were the dollars, but when you took them back into cedis, you got very, very few cedis for farmers. And at the same time, Ghana was undergoing a macroeconomic crisis, so cocoa farmers would earn very few cedis, and there'd be virtually nothing for those cedis to buy in any case. So at that point, the Ghanaian cocoa sector all but collapsed. People virtually stopped harvesting, except for the few who were close to Togo and Cote d'Ivoire, who could take their cocoa over the border and get a better price than they could exporting through Ghana. Now, when we come to the year 1990, I came across this quote from a very prominent agricultural economist, writing in the year 1990. And this reminds us of how pessimistic the view was about Africa. Only to feed her growing population at the present level of per capita food consumption, Africa would thus need to increase her food production at a rate of, say, 3.2% per year for several decades in succession. So writing in 1990, just to stay level of the game, Africa would have to increase food output 3.2% per annum. And this same writer went on to write the following rather foolish hostage to fortune. This is, of course, an impossible challenge for her to meet. Now, do keep in mind that little figure of 3.2%. It's going to come back in one or two slides. That was going to be impossible in the year 1990. Impossible. Very serious agricultural economist. So then we come to the 1990s. And in the 1990s, agriculture was basically lost to sight. Big policy making, agriculture had disappeared. And it had disappeared because of legacy issues, where we'd come from. Agriculture was seen as failing, and it was seen as being a difficult sector. The World Bank, for example, did a whole series of evaluations of its portfolio of investments in the early 1990s. The worst performing investments were in agriculture in Africa, and particularly in the livestock sector. And they looked at those and they said, oh my goodness, no point in putting money into agriculture. It just doesn't work. And this hammering on about negative protection as the key issue, it was a key issue, but it became, in some people's imaginations, the only issue. So if you could deal with negative protection, you dealt with the problems of agriculture. So then our second element here was the triumph of the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus has many elements of a neoliberal, market-orientated and coordinated economic policy. And it said we shall have a small state, a minimal state for some people, and economic activity will be private sector coordinated by free markets. And in the conception of the Washington Consensus, no sector had a right to be considered special. As long as you got the macroeconomic policy right, who cared about the sectors, yeah? All sectors were meant to be competitive. They could either be competitive or not competitive. There was no special reason to lavish policy attention on agriculture compared to other sectors. And the experience of the 1990s was that country after country developed an economy, made reforms, particularly devaluations, cutting back the state, marketing boards being privatized or changing their remits, and the introduction of liberalized economies. But as we shall return to later during the day, the experience of rural markets that didn't quite react in the way that the Washington Consensus would say they did. Two rural markets in particular repeatedly failed to function across Africa, and those were the markets for financial services and the markets for seed, fertilizer, and other agricultural inputs. Now, when we come to the new millennium, things changed, and optimism started to come back into ideas about Africa. Here's one element of the story of optimism, and all you're looking at there are commodity prices from the early 2000s onwards through the spike of 07, 08, and subsequently. Basically, commodity prices which had been falling in real terms from the 1980s onwards, those commodity prices started to turn upwards from the early 2000s onwards, and round about 07, 08, there were very considerable spikes in those commodity prices. So the outlook for agriculture changed. Agriculture was something that could be profitable. And an element of that was looking across the Indian Ocean at the burgeoning imports of Asia. This shows oilseeds and vegetable oil imports by Asian countries, particularly China, but also South Asia, enormous increases in imports of those into Asia, representing potentially an opportunity for Africa. And then we have the return of economic growth. From 1996 from 75 to 95, typical growth rates, economic growth rates in Africa was 0% per capita. A couple of decades with almost no growth at all. Since the mid-1990s, we get growth rates which are 3.2% per capita. That's not the 3.2% I'm going to talk about in a moment, but it's another 3.2% per capita. That map just shows the darker colors are the faster growing countries of Africa. The lighter ones are the ones with slower rates of growth. But from the mid-2000s onwards, it became very clear that Africa had some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and particularly outside of Southeast Asia and Asia. There was also the change in that net rate of assistance for agriculture. Here is a series of about 10 countries, and those 10 countries, that's just looking at their net rate of assistance for agriculture from 70 to 1985, and you can see that some countries, Tanzania here, tremendously strong effective taxation of its farmers, Mozambique, and what have we got here? This is Cote d'Ivoire, very strong taxation of their economies. But if we look at the situation in the 2000s, the situation, as you can see, in almost all cases, the degree of taxation has been very substantially reduced. So those economic disincentives that used to be there have been very largely corrected. And then there was the interest in land. And this particular map comes from a 2009 publication by the World Bank called The Sleeping Giant, which basically says that in the Guinea savanna of Africa, we have, something like 600 million hectares of little-used land, much of which, given the right infrastructure and given the right kind of agricultural technology, could become at least moderately intensive farming. And the analogy that was put into this report was to look at the Cerrado of northeast Brazil and to look at northeastern Thailand, both areas of only modest agricultural potential that have become export powerhouses. And the argument of this report was that Africa had hugely abundant areas of Guinea savanna that could become similarly export powerhouses given the right kind of infrastructural investment and the right kind of agricultural technology to take advantage of the soils and climate in those areas. So all of that leads to a situation where agriculture becomes back on the agenda after the 1990s being almost lost to sight. We have the Maputo Declaration of 2003 and the subsequent CAADP experience. We have initiatives like the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. We have more moves towards regional economic integration. And the world of agricultural development is once again potentially one of opportunity, with more sense of optimism than pessimism about what is possible. Let's just have a look at a few statistics on performance. And if we look at this, we can see this particular pattern. This is looking once again at food production per head since the early 1980s coming through to 2009. And we're going to be looking at Africa, which will be a thick yellow line. We'll look at various components of Africa, and we've got South America and Asia in there as comparators. And if we look at what's happening here, well, there's the line for Africa. Unlike from the early 1970s onwards, we do actually have increasing food production per capita. It's 20% up at the end of this particular period. It varies very considerably by area. Now, let's see which ones we've got there. These three here are variously Southern Africa, Middle Africa, and East Africa is here, Middle Africa is there, and that's Southern Africa. So we can see three regions of Africa in which the situation isn't very good. Indeed, they're struggling to come back to 100%, although there's some sign of an upturn there. But we have two regions of Africa where the increase is very considerable indeed. One of those is North Africa, which is this one here, but this is West Africa. And West Africa, at least to the mid-2000s, performs extremely well. Indeed, the production per capita for West Africa is up by more than 50% over those 25 years or so. There's South America in the blue as a comparator, and there's Asia in the red. So you can see that the performance of two African regions is as good in comparison to South America and Asia. And the big question that you have when you look at these, at a graph like this, is you say, what distinguishes West Africa and North Africa that is failing here in Middle Eastern and Southern Africa? I like to have that regional breakdown because an awful lot of the analyses tend to just show this and compare it to those two and say Africa is failing, whereas if you start to look at the components of Africa, you say, no, hang on, there are parts of Africa where we're seeing at least modest success. This is a chart that looks at the growth of agricultural production from 1990 through to 2011. It's using the FAO statistics. They're not perfect, but this is looking at overall growth of production during this particular period. And first off, we're just looking at total production, and then we're going to look at production per capita. Here's the overall African performance since 1990, and it turns out to be almost exactly 3.2% per annum increase, which I think is what the unmentioned economist said was impossible. So there has been growth. That's what it looks like per capita. It's more modest growth per capita. There's one region where it has apparently fallen behind, and that's Middle or Central Africa. But everywhere else, we've got a certain amount of growth per capita, our highest performers being West Africa and North Africa. So we're living in times of positive growth, not spectacular. It certainly doesn't come up to the CAADP targets, but there is growth. And I've got a couple of charts here that look at changes in productivity. And basically what we're looking at here, this is a land productivity measure. It's looking at the value of production per hectare by the various regions of Africa. That's the situation in 1990-92. That's what it looks like more recently, around about 2011. And the third series that's on it, that is the percentage increase. So for the whole of Africa, we're looking at a percentage increase of round about 45%. There are variations across Africa. Everywhere is getting higher land productivity. The biggest single increases we're seeing here are in Northern Africa. Interestingly, Middle Africa has one of the biggest increases in production on land, and the weakest performance here is Eastern Africa, but it's still a performance which is 35% more. So we are seeing some increases in productivity of land, and here's what it looks like for labor. Here we're looking at the added value per agricultural worker from the early 1990s to round about 2010. There's enormous difference between Southern Africa and the rest of Africa, and that's because the UN definition of Southern Africa is completely dominated by South Africa. So that's the situation we had then. That's the situation more recently. What you can see there is, once again, we have increments, though the increments aren't necessarily very large. And some of the biggest increments are actually in the areas which already had relatively high labor productivity. So overall for Africa, what we're seeing here is an increment of round about 25% on labor productivity, with some big differences between North, Southern and Western, and Eastern and Middle. And indeed, Eastern Africa has the lowest increase, but it's still a 10% increase. So we have some modest, perhaps weak increases in labor productivity, some modest increases in land productivity, and we have modest increases in overall. Now, looking at those performance figures, if you wanted to summarize what you see in those charts, you'd say this is a glass half full or it's a glass half empty. So you take it what you like, how you want to see that. Is it half empty with room for improvement, or do we see a glass half full where you say there is progress, there is a certain level of dynamic, there is something to build on? But there are enormous variations when you look across regions, and if we took individual countries, you would see even bigger differences in this. And one of the conclusions when I look through these statistics is that there are enough countries with some very good experiences that says that while Africa can learn from other parts of the world, there's plenty to be learned from experiences inside of the continent. And there is scope, as I will talk about later today, to learn lessons from Asia, but to learn the right lessons from Asia. There's an awful lot of writing about African agricultural economy that tends to use Asia as a stick with which to look at African performance and to say things are really dreadful. I'd rather look at what the big successes in Africa are and compare across them. And if you're wondering what might be seen as big successes, in a slide later today, we'll look at the case of Ghana and what happened to Ghana's agriculture between the early 1980s and the mid-2000s, which is certainly some very impressive statistics.